I spent 12 agonizing hours cooking a massive Christmas Eve dinner for the husband I was desperately trying to win back. But when I opened my front door, he was not alone. He brought his mistress, and she was wearing the exact custom diamond pendant my husband swore was a $12,000 legal retainer. My father, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, pulled me into the kitchen and whispered 2 words that changed everything. Smile for now. Minutes later, my dad exposed a financial lie so massive it made my husband lose absolutely everything. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old, and I work as an office manager and payroll specialist for a mid-sized logistics firm in Chicago. I am a practical woman. I deal in spreadsheets, tax brackets, bi-weekly direct deposits, and quarterly audits. I am not the kind of person who thrives on drama or chaos. I like ledgers that balance and columns that add up. But 15 minutes before my husband was scheduled to walk through my front door, my life felt like a ledger completely drowning in red ink. My kitchen felt like a war zone, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the dull roar of the oven exhaust fan. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. Outside my house in a quiet, tree-lined Chicago suburb, thick snow was falling, burying the driveway in a pristine, freezing layer of white. Inside, the air was thick with the rich, heavy scent of garlic, rosemary, and roasting meat. I had been on my feet since 4 in the morning preparing a massive traditional prime rib dinner. My hands were red and blistered from the heat of the pans. My lower back ached inside my sensible shoes. I wiped a streak of flour off my forehead with the back of my wrist and stared at the digital clock glowing brightly on the microwave. He was supposed to be here at 4:30. I opened the heavy oven door, pulling out the massive cut of beef to baste it in its own juices. My hands were shaking. They had been shaking all day. David and I had been on a trial separation for exactly 3 months. 3 months of sleeping in an empty bed. 3 months of staring at the ceiling, wondering where everything went so terribly wrong. David is 34. He is a commercial real estate broker, a man who wears $3,000 tailored suits, leases luxury cars he can barely afford, and constantly talks about his grand vision for the future. When he packed his bags and walked out the door in September, he did not say he was leaving because he fell out of love. He blamed me. He stood in our foyer, adjusting his expensive watch, and told me I was too focused on my mundane payroll job. He said I was small-minded. He said I did not support his ambitions, that my practical nature was dragging down his potential, and that he needed space to breathe and build his empire without my constant financial anxiety suffocating him. I believed him. That was the tragic part. I absorbed his accusations like a sponge. I convinced myself that I was the problem, that I had been a terrible, unsupportive wife. So when he called me 6 weeks into our separation, sounding panicked and desperate, I did exactly what a supportive wife was supposed to do. He told me his commercial brokerage was struggling. He claimed his liquidity was completely tied up in escrow on a massive commercial strip mall development downtown, and he needed a massive bridge loan to keep his business afloat until the deal closed. He needed $300,000. He needed me to co-sign a new joint mortgage on our home. "If you believed in me, Claire, you would sign," he had said over the phone, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You always said you wanted to be a better partner. This is your chance to prove it." I signed the papers. I put my pristine credit score, my modest savings, and my sensible life on the line for him. And tonight was supposed to be the reward for that ultimate sacrifice. Tonight was supposed to be our fresh start. David promised he was coming over for Christmas Eve dinner. He promised he was coming alone. He promised he was bringing the finalized countersigned documents for the joint mortgage to prove that we were in this together, that his business was saved, and that our marriage was going to survive. "Claire, you are going to burn a hole through that prime rib if you keep staring at it." I jumped, dropping the basting spoon with a loud clatter against the roasting pan. I turned around to see my father Thomas standing in the doorway of the kitchen. My dad is 64 years old and recently retired after spending 35 years as an auditor for the IRS. He is a man who spent his entire career hunting down tax evaders, unearthing hidden bank accounts and reading the exact lies people try to hide in their paperwork. He was holding a crystal glass of neat bourbon, watching me run myself ragged with a quiet, analytical gaze that made me instantly defensive. "It needs to be perfect, Dad," I said, quickly retrieving the spoon and shoving the heavy pan back into the roaring oven. "David likes the crust crispy. If it is soggy, he will complain about it all night." Thomas took a slow sip of his bourbon. The ice clinked softly against the glass. A man who needs his wife's logistics payroll salary to bail out his commercial brokerage is not a real estate broker, Claire. He is a liability. And a man who complains about a home-cooked meal after abandoning his wife for 3 months is not a husband. He is a parasite. "Dad, please," I begged, leaning against the granite counter and squeezing my eyes shut. "Not tonight. Do not do this tonight. David is coming over to make things right. He is bringing the paperwork. He promised we are going to talk about ending the separation. I just want a nice, peaceful Christmas Eve." My father walked fully into the kitchen, his leather slippers silent against the hardwood floor. He set his bourbon glass down on the island and crossed his arms. "I am your father, Claire. It is my job to protect you, especially when you are refusing to protect yourself. I have been watching you spin yourself into a panic attack since sunrise. You set the dining room table with your mother's good Waterford crystal. You bought a $100 bottle of wine that you cannot comfortably afford. You are trying to buy back the affection of a man who manipulated you into taking on $350,000 in debt. It is an investment in his business," I argued, my voice rising defensively. "I manage payroll, Dad. I know how cash flow works. Sometimes businesses need a bridge loan to cover operating costs during a major acquisition. He is closing a huge deal on a residential luxury tower downtown. Once the commission clears, the loan will be paid off. He swore to me." Thomas tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. His IRS instincts were fully engaged, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Claire commercial real estate deals have paper trails. Escrow accounts have documentation. Did he show you the prospectus for this massive deal before you signed your name on that joint mortgage? Did he show you his business ledgers? I swallowed hard, looking away from his piercing stare. I did not need to see the ledgers. I lied, my chest tightening with a sudden, unexplainable spike of anxiety. He is my husband. We are building a life together. I trust him. You trust a man who charged $12,000 to your personal credit card 4 months ago? Thomas asked, his voice dropping low, hitting the exact nerve I had been desperately trying to ignore. My breath caught in my throat. I hated that my dad knew about that. I hated that I had broken down and called him crying when I saw that massive charge on my statement back in August. When I confronted David about it, he had exploded. He claimed it was a desperate emergency retainer for his real estate attorney to fight off a bogus, frivolous lawsuit from a rival commercial firm. He told me that if I did not pay the credit card bill, his business would be seized and we would lose our home. I drained my personal savings account to pay off that $12,000 charge because I wanted to be the loyal, supportive wife he kept accusing me of failing to be. That was a legal emergency, I whispered, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. He needed a lawyer. You know how vicious the commercial real estate world is in Chicago. People sue each other over zoning rights all the time. My father sighed, a deep, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 uncovered frauds. He picked up his bourbon glass again. Lawyers issue invoices, Claire. They provide itemized billing statements. They do not just swipe a spouse's Visa card in the middle of the night without a paper trail. I spent 35 years watching desperate men try to hide their money. David's business accounts have been entirely opaque to you for over a year. You handle the complex payroll logistics for hundreds of truck drivers and warehouse workers every single day. You are brilliant with numbers. Why are you choosing to be blind when it comes to the numbers in your own home? Because if I look too closely, I might lose my marriage, I thought to myself. But I did not say it out loud. I could not admit that to my father. I could not admit that the reason I was exhausting myself in this hot, suffocating kitchen was because I was terrified of being alone. I was terrified of failing at the one thing I was supposed to be good at. "He is bringing the countersigned documents tonight," I said stubbornly, smoothing the front of my flour-dusted apron. "He said he wants to move back in. He said he misses me. Just let me have this dinner, Dad. Please. Just play nice. Talk to him about football. Talk to him about the weather. Do not interrogate him about the loan." Thomas stared at me for an agonizing moment. I could see the gears turning in his head, his sharp analytical mind processing a dozen different variables I could not yet see. He reached inside the breast pocket of his thick wool cardigan. For a second, I thought he was going to pull out his reading glasses. Instead, he adjusted his posture and let his hand drop back to his side. "Fine," Thomas said quietly. "I will play nice. I will sit at your beautiful table, and I will eat your perfect prime rib, and I will talk to your husband about the weather. But I want you to remember one thing, Claire." What I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "A liar will always overplay his hand," Thomas said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "And when he does, you have to promise me that you will stop closing your eyes." Before I could formulate a response, before I could ask him why he looked so incredibly certain of David's guilt, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4:30. The sound echoed through the quiet, snow-muffled house. My heart instantly leaped into my throat. The argument with my father evaporated, replaced entirely by a desperate rushing wave of hope. He was here. My husband was finally here. Our separation was ending. We were going to drink wine, eat dinner, and sign the papers that would bind us back together. I quickly untied my apron, tossing it onto the kitchen island. I ran my hands down the front of my dark green holiday dress, making sure there were no flour stains. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door, pinching my cheeks to bring some color back into my exhausted face. Through the large bay window in the living room, I saw the sweeping arc of headlights cutting through the heavy falling snow. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. I heard the engine cut off. I heard the heavy thud of a car door closing. The crunch of expensive leather boots walking up the snow-packed walkway. I walked out of the kitchen and stepped into the main foyer, my hands clasped tightly together to stop their shaking. My father followed slowly behind me, standing in the shadows near the living room archway, his bourbon glass resting quietly in his hand. The doorbell rang, a sharp, piercing chime that signaled the end of my trial separation and the beginning of my new life. I reached for the brass handle, took a deep, shaky breath, pasted on the most loving, supportive smile I could muster, and pulled the heavy oak door open. The chime of the doorbell vibrated through the floorboards. I stood frozen in the foyer for a fraction of a second. My pulse hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The moment I had been praying for, crying for, and exhausting myself over for 3 agonizing months. I wiped my damp, trembling hands down the sides of my dark green dress. I took a deep, unsteady breath, trying to calm the nervous fluttering in my stomach. The heavy oak door stood between me and the man I had promised to love for better or worse. I genuinely believed we were finally moving back toward better. I reached for the brass handle. The metal felt cold against my heated skin. I turned the lock. I pulled the door open, stretching my lips into a warm, welcoming, and desperately hopeful smile. The biting chill of the Chicago winter swept into the warm foyer, carrying with it the scent of pine and fresh snow. But the cold wind was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing shock that hit my chest. David stood on the porch. He looked immaculate. He was wearing his charcoal gray tailored overcoat, his hair perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven. He smelled of the expensive cedar and bergamot cologne I had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. He looked like a man ready to conquer the world. He did not look like a man coming to humbly ask his wife for forgiveness. And the reason for his arrogant posture became devastatingly clear a split second later. David was not alone. Standing right beside him, huddled under the shelter of the porch awning, was a woman. She was young, 26, maybe 27 at the oldest. She had cascading, flawless blonde hair that fell in perfect, deliberate waves over the collar of a stunning cream-colored cashmere coat. Her makeup was immaculate, glowing with that effortless, youthful radiance that takes an hour and hundreds of dollars of products to achieve. She was holding a small silver gift bag and shivering with an exaggerated, delicate delicacy. I stood there in my sensible shoes and my practical dress, smelling of roasted garlic and anxiety. I literally felt my brain short-circuit. The smile on my face calcified. My vocal cords completely paralyzed. I just stared at the two of them, trying to force reality to make sense. He promised he was coming alone. He explicitly told me this dinner was about us. Claire, David said loudly. His voice was entirely too cheerful, booming with that fake boisterous energy he always used when he was closing a deal or hiding a lie. It is freezing out here. Let us in, will you? He stepped out of his snow-covered boots and breezed past me into the warmth of the house, bringing the blonde woman right along with him. She stepped onto the hardwood floor, her expensive stiletto heels clicking sharply against the wood. David turned back to me, clapping his hands together to shake off the cold. Claire, this is Jessica. She is a junior associate at the brokerage. Her flight back to Denver got canceled this afternoon because of the blizzard over the Rockies. She was going to spend Christmas Eve completely alone in a miserable airport hotel. I knew you would not want anyone to be stranded on the holidays, so I told her my incredibly hospitable wife was making enough prime rib to feed an army. Jessica offered me a bright, glossy smile that did not reach her eyes. It is so nice to finally meet you, Claire. David talks about you all the time. Thank you so much for letting me crash your dinner. I promise I will stay out of your way. My vision actually blurred at the edges. A junior associate, a stranded coworker. It was the oldest, most transparent cliché in the history of failing marriages. My husband had brought a beautiful young woman to our reconciliation dinner. I felt a surge of hot, desperate anger rising in my throat. I opened my mouth to tell her to leave. I was going to demand that David take her back to whatever hotel he found her in. But before a single syllable could escape my lips, David stepped right into my personal space. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from mine under the guise of giving me a kiss on the cheek. His hand gripped my upper arm. His fingers squeezed just hard enough to trap me in place. Do not make a scene, Claire, he whispered directly into my ear. His voice was stripped of all the fake holiday cheer. It was low, vicious, and dripping with manipulation. Be a good host. It is Christmas. Do not ruin this night by being paranoid and hysterical. I am giving you a chance to prove you can support my professional life. Do not embarrass me. He pulled back his face, instantly transforming back into a relaxed, charming grin. He patted my shoulder and turned to Jessica. Let me take your coat, Jess. The house is warm. I stood paralyzed in my own foyer. He had weaponized my deepest insecurity in a matter of seconds. He knew I was terrified of being the unsupportive, nagging wife. He knew I had spent the last 3 months agonizing over his accusations. By framing this as a test of my hospitality and my support for his career, he had expertly backed me into a psychological corner. If I threw them out, I was the hysterical, jealous wife who ruined Christmas and destroyed the marriage. If I let them stay, I was quietly swallowing my own humiliation. I watched, feeling completely numb, as Jessica reached for the buttons of her cream-colored cashmere coat. I tried to focus on my breathing. I tried to tell myself that maybe David was telling the truth. Maybe she really was just a stranded coworker. Maybe I was projecting my own insecurities onto an innocent situation. I desperately wanted to believe the man I loved. Then the coat parted, and the last shred of my denial burned to ash. Jessica slipped the heavy cashmere off her shoulders, handing it to David. She was wearing a plunging emerald green silk dress, and resting perfectly against her collarbone, catching the warm light of the chandelier overhead, was a necklace. It was a custom-cut sapphire surrounded by a halo of flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds suspended on a delicate platinum chain. The air vanished from the room. The blood roared in my ears. I felt a physical, sickening punch directly to my gut so hard I actually swayed on my feet. I knew that necklace. I knew exactly what it was, where it came from, and precisely how much it cost. Last winter, 14 months ago, David and I had attended a charity gala downtown. We had walked past an exclusive independent jeweler on Oak Street. I had stopped in front of the illuminated display window, completely mesmerized by that exact sapphire pendant. I had pointed it out to David. I told him it was the most breathtaking piece of jewelry I had ever seen. We even went inside so I could look at it up close. The jeweler had proudly explained it was a one-of-a-kind, custom-designed piece. The price tag was $12,000. David had laughed, kissed my temple, and told me that maybe one day when his brokerage finally hit the big leagues, he would buy it for me. I never asked for it. I never expected it. It was just a beautiful fantasy. But 4 months ago, reality had come crashing down in the form of a massive, terrifying credit card statement. A $12,000 charge from that exact same Oak Street jeweler had appeared on my personal Visa card. When I confronted David about it, he had exploded in a rage that terrified me. He swore he had not bought jewelry. He swore the charge was processed through a dummy corporation owned by his real estate attorney. He claimed he needed a desperate emergency legal retainer to fight off a vicious lawsuit from a rival commercial firm. He told me that if I disputed the charge or refused to pay the credit card bill, his business would be seized and we would lose our home. I had drained my personal savings account to pay off that $12,000 charge. I had sat at my kitchen table crying out of pure stress, transferring every dollar of my emergency fund. I had canceled my meager gym membership. I had stopped buying fresh produce and lived on rice and canned beans. I remembered the sleepless nights staring at the ceiling trying to calculate how many months of extreme budgeting it would take to recover from a $12,000 hit. I had done it all because David had convinced me that his entire professional future depended on that money. He had convinced me that our marriage hung in the balance. And now that $12,000 emergency legal retainer was hanging around the neck of a 26-year-old junior associate in my foyer. He had not just cheated on me. That would have been a mundane, ordinary betrayal. This was something far more sinister. He had made me finance his affair. He had forced me to drain my own life savings to buy his mistress the exact piece of jewelry I had once admired. He had looked me dead in the eyes, screamed at me for being an unsupportive partner, manipulated my guilt, and used my credit line to drape diamonds over another woman. The level of sociopathic entitlement required to pull off a lie of that magnitude was beyond anything I had ever comprehended. I stared at the sapphire. The deep blue stone seemed to mock me, glittering against Jessica's skin. The intricate platinum setting caught the light from the hallway chandelier, shooting tiny rainbows across the foyer. She noticed me looking. She reached up her perfectly manicured fingers, touching the diamond halo with a practiced, arrogant grace. Her nails were painted a flawless, glossy red. "Oh, do you like it?" Jessica asked, her voice dripping with fake modesty. She tilted her chin up just a fraction, a subconscious display of dominance. It was a Christmas gift. Someone very special told me that the color brought out my eyes. He said he wanted me to have something completely unique. I could not breathe. The walls of the foyer felt like they were collapsing inward, suffocating me. The rich smell of the roasting prime rib from the kitchen suddenly made me nauseous. A dark, terrifying wave of pure rage began to rise in my chest. It was not the kind of fleeting anger that makes you yell or throw a plate. It was the kind of deep tectonic anger that fundamentally alters your personality. It was the kind of rage that makes you want to burn a house to the ground and dance in the ashes. I looked from the sapphire pendant up to David's face. He was watching me carefully. His charming, easygoing smile was still plastered on his face for Jessica's benefit, but his eyes were hard, calculating, and full of a silent warning. He was daring me to speak. He was daring me to shatter the illusion. He was waiting to see if his gaslighting had worked. He was waiting to see if the dutiful, practical payroll manager, the woman who balanced ledgers and avoided conflict, would just swallow her pride, lower her head, and set another plate at the holiday table. He genuinely believed I was too weak to challenge him in front of company. My hands balled into tight fists at my sides. My fingernails bit so deeply into my palms that the skin broke, leaving tiny crescent moon indentations. The urge to scream, to lunge forward, and rip that fragile platinum chain right off her throat was overwhelming. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to unleash 15 years of suppressed emotion to expose him right there on the hardwood floor, to tell this arrogant girl exactly whose bank account had paid for her unique Christmas gift. I took a step forward. The polite, accommodating facade I had worn for 5 years completely fractured. My jaw locked, and a low, involuntary sound of pure fury started to build in the back of my throat. I was going to ruin his life. I was going to tear his entire, carefully curated world apart right here in the entrance of my home. I was going to tell her the truth. But before I could unleash the explosion, before I could scream the words that would blow this entire night wide open, a calm, steady hand landed firmly on my right shoulder. I flinched, startled by the sudden grounding contact. My father stepped slowly out of the shadows of the living room archway. Thomas moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of a man who had spent 3 decades dissecting lies, tax fraud, and corporate embezzlement for a living. He did not look surprised by the blonde woman standing in the foyer. He did not look angry. He looked completely and utterly in control. Thomas stepped smoothly between me and the doorway, his body physically blocking my path to David and Jessica. He held his bourbon glass in his left hand, the amber liquid perfectly still catching the light. David, my father, said, his voice rich, steady, and incredibly polite. "Welcome, and you brought a guest out of the cold. How remarkably generous of you." The tension in the foyer was thick enough to choke on, but my father simply offered a warm, welcoming smile that chilled me to the bone. The true conflict had just begun. I practically sprinted away from the foyer. My sensible shoes slipped slightly on the polished hardwood as I bolted for the kitchen. I pushed through the heavy wooden swinging door and let it shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of my husband laughing with the woman who was wearing my life savings around her neck. The sudden isolation of the kitchen hit me like a physical blow. The air in the room was stifling thick with the heavy, savory aroma of the prime rib I had spent my entire day obsessing over. The heat radiating from the oven felt oppressive, wrapping around my throat and making it impossible to pull a full breath into my lungs. I marched straight to the granite island and gripped the edge with both hands. I squeezed the cold stone until my knuckles turned completely white, my entire body vibrating with a rage so intense it made my teeth ache. I stared at the massive roasting pan sitting on the stovetop. Inside rested the expensive cut of beef I had seasoned, basted, and tended to like a precious, fragile thing, all to prove to David that I was a supportive, dedicated wife. I wanted to grab the heavy iron handles of that pan. I wanted to march right back out into the foyer, throw the front door wide open, and launch the entire dripping, roasting mess directly into the freezing snowbank on the front lawn. Then I wanted to pack my bags and disappear. How could he do this? How could he look me in the eye, manipulate my deepest insecurities, and bring his mistress into my home on Christmas Eve? He had forced me to co-sign a $300,000 commercial loan claiming his business was on the brink of collapse. He had made me drain my personal savings to pay off a $12,000 credit card charge, swearing it was an emergency legal retainer. And now that exact same $12,000 was resting against Jessica's collarbone in the form of a custom sapphire pendant. The audacity was so monstrous, so entirely calculated that I felt a hysterical scream building in the back of my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a hot, bitter tear slipping down my cheek. I was preparing to tear off my apron, walk out there, and burn my marriage to the ground in front of both of them. The soft, muted squeak of the kitchen door hinges made me freeze. The heavy wooden panel swung open and gently clicked shut. I opened my eyes and spun around, fully expecting David to be standing there ready to deliver another hushed, aggressive lecture about my hospitality. Instead, my father stood just inside the kitchen. Thomas moved with a quiet, grounded stillness that completely defied the chaos exploding inside my head. He had his crystal glass of neat bourbon in one hand, the amber liquid perfectly level. He did not look shocked. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had already solved a very complex, very dangerous puzzle. I let go of the counter, my chest heaving as I tried to compose myself. "Dad!" I choked out, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. Did you see her? Did you see the necklace she is wearing? That is the $12,000 charge. That is the money I gave him to save his business. He brought his mistress into my house. I am going to kick them both out. I am going to call the police. I am going to tell her exactly who paid for those diamonds. I took a step toward the doorway, my vision narrowing into a tunnel of pure destructive adrenaline. But my father moved faster than I anticipated. He set his bourbon glass down on the butcher block table with a quiet thud and stepped directly into my path. He reached out and placed both of his large, warm hands firmly on my shoulders. The grip was steadying, anchoring me to the floor and halting my frantic momentum. He leaned in close, his face just inches from mine, and looked me dead in the eyes. The expression on his face was one of absolute terrifying clarity. "Smile for now," he whispered. His voice was incredibly low, barely carrying over the hum of the oven exhaust fan, but it held the commanding authority of a man who had spent 35 years hunting down financial criminals. Let him dig his own grave. I stared at him, my breathing ragged. "What are you talking about?" I whispered back, my voice shaking with confusion and rage. "He is already standing in the grave, Dad. He brought another woman to our reconciliation dinner. He stole my money to buy her jewelry. What more is there to dig?" My father did not argue. He simply let go of my right shoulder, reached inside the breast pocket of his thick wool cardigan, and pulled out a plain, unmarked manila folder. It was thick, the edges slightly worn from being handled. He held it up between us, tapping the heavy stack of papers inside with his index finger. "You think I have just been sitting by the fire drinking bourbon for the last 3 months? Claire," my father asked softly. "You think I watched you cry over that mysterious credit card charge, and then watched you sign your name to a $300,000 joint mortgage to bail out his failing brokerage, and did absolutely nothing? I audited federal tax returns for 3 decades. I know what a panicked, sinking man looks like, and David has been sweating for a year." He placed the manila folder flat on the granite island right next to the cutting board where I was supposed to slice the bread. I stepped closer, my accounting brain suddenly wrestling with my broken heart. I stared at the folder like it was a live, explosive device. "When David pressured you to co-sign that massive commercial loan, he claimed his liquidity was tied up in a downtown development project," Thomas explained, his voice returning to a steady, clinical rhythm. "He told you his accounts were temporarily frozen in escrow, and he needed a bridge loan to cover his operating costs. But you are a payroll specialist, Claire. You know better than anyone that payroll leaves a trail. Real businesses have ledgers, employer identification numbers, and quarterly filings. When a man refuses to show his wife the prospectus for a $300,000 liability, he is hiding something much worse than a failing business." I reached out with trembling fingers and rested my hand on the cover of the folder. "What did you do, Dad?" I asked, my voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "I did my job," Thomas replied evenly. "I pulled the public records for his commercial real estate brokerage. I ran background checks on the limited liability companies he registered over the past 2 years. I traced the property deeds, the notary stamps on his recent acquisitions, and the corporate filings for his so-called massive downtown development project. It took me 12 weeks of quiet digging, reaching out to old contacts and cross-referencing the loan documents he had you sign. I did not say anything to you because I needed undeniable concrete proof before I shattered your world. I knew you desperately wanted to save your marriage. I knew you would defend him if I only brought you suspicions. I needed the paper trail." My stomach performed a sickening flip. The heat of the kitchen suddenly felt freezing cold. I looked up from the folder to my father's weathered, serious face. "You found the paper trail," I stated, though it was not really a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "I found everything, Claire. I found out exactly where that $300,000 joint mortgage actually went. And I can promise you, it did not go into a business escrow account." He gestured toward the swinging wooden door that separated us from the foyer, where David and Jessica were currently taking off their boots and laughing about the snowstorm. "That woman out there, Thomas said, his voice dropping into a register so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. Her name is Jessica, yes. But she is not just a stranded junior associate, and she is certainly not just a mistress. I blinked my mind, struggling to process the layers of deception. What do you mean she is not just a mistress? I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. Thomas leaned closer, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that demanded my complete focus. I ran the registration on the new shell company David set up last month, he explained. The company that supposedly holds the deed to the downtown property he used as collateral to get you to sign that loan. Jessica's signature is on the incorporation documents. She is listed as the primary managing partner of the holding company. The words washed over me, heavy and suffocating. I manage an entire office. I handle corporate payroll and logistics for a major firm. I know exactly what it means to be listed as a managing partner on a shell corporation. It means you are legally tied to the assets. It means you control the flow of the money. He didn't just bring his mistress to dinner, Claire, my father whispered, tapping the manila folder one last time. He brought his accomplice. I physically staggered backward, my lower back hitting the edge of the granite counter. The magnitude of the betrayal expanded outward, swallowing every rational thought I had left. David had not just cheated on my heart. He had orchestrated a massive calculated financial fraud, and he had used my pristine credit score, my hard-earned savings, and my desperate desire to save our marriage to fund it. And the woman wearing my $12,000 sapphire pendant was not just a naive girl he picked up at a hotel bar. She was his active, willing partner in stealing my future. They are here tonight to celebrate. Thomas continued, his voice relentless and steady. David is arrogant. He thinks he won. He thinks you are too busy cooking his dinner and begging for his affection to notice that he is actively robbing you blind. He brought her here to flaunt his victory right in your face under the guise of holiday charity. He wants to sit at your table, eat your food, and laugh at you in secret. A wave of nausea rolled through me, followed immediately by a sharp electric jolt of pure adrenaline. The tears that had been threatening to spill over my eyelashes completely evaporated. The sorrow and the heartbreak vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. I looked at the massive prime rib resting in the roasting pan. I looked at the crystal wine glasses waiting on the serving tray. 10 minutes ago, this dinner was a desperate, humiliating plea for my husband to love me again. Now it was a battleground. I realized my father was absolutely right. If I stormed out there crying and screaming, David would spin the narrative. He would call me crazy. He would deny everything, rush Jessica out the door, and use my emotional outburst as the perfect excuse to finally file for divorce while running off with my $300,000. I could not let him control the narrative. I had to let him walk blindly into the trap. What do we do? I asked, my voice no longer shaking. It sounded hollow, detached, and entirely professional. Thomas picked up his bourbon glass. He offered me a small, proud smile, the kind of smile he used to give me when I successfully balanced a complicated algebraic equation in high school. We are going to serve them dinner, he said simply. We are going to sit down at that beautiful table you set. We are going to pour that expensive wine. We are going to ask Jessica all about her fascinating career in commercial real estate. And we are going to let David think he is the smartest man in the room right up until the moment the walls cave in on him. Just serve the soup, Claire. I stared at the manila folder sitting on the island. It held the absolute destruction of the man I had loved for 5 years. I nodded slowly. I reached out and pushed the folder behind the heavy wooden knife block, hiding it completely from view. I turned to the stove, grabbed 2 linen pot holders, and lifted the heavy iron roasting pan. The smell of the roasted garlic and rosemary no longer made me nauseous. It smelled like preparation. I compartmentalized every single ounce of my grief, locked it in a dark box in the back of my mind, and shifted my entire being into the logistics manager I was trained to be. I was going to manage this dinner exactly the way I managed a corporate audit. I was going to smile, I was going to serve the soup, and I was going to watch my husband dig a grave so deep he would never ever climb out. I turned back to my father. The polite, accommodating wife was dead. The payroll manager was clocking in. "Let us go feed my husband," I said. I pushed open the swinging wooden door, carrying the serving tray of appetizers, and walked back into the foyer with the brightest, most welcoming smile I had ever faked in my entire life. The transition from the kitchen to the dining room felt like walking onto a theater stage where I was the only person who knew the script. I carried the heavy silver tray of roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes through the swinging door with a perfectly pleasant smile plastered across my face. The dining room looked like a magazine cover. The soft glow of the chandelier caught the edges of my mother's Waterford crystal. The smell of the rosemary prime rib filled the air. It was the picture of a perfect American Christmas Eve, but underneath that warm holiday veneer, the air in the room was so thick with tension, it felt hard to breathe. David had already taken his usual seat at the head of the long mahogany table. He looked entirely too comfortable. Jessica was sitting directly to his right in the chair that traditionally belonged to me. She was adjusting her napkin, looking around my home with the openly critical gaze of someone evaluating a property for a teardown. She let her eyes wander over the vintage crown molding and the modest floral centerpiece I had spent an hour arranging. She looked unimpressed. The custom sapphire pendant resting against her skin caught the candlelight, throwing tiny blue reflections across the crisp white tablecloth. It took every ounce of professional restraint I had cultivated in my years of corporate management to keep my hands steady as I set the heavy serving dishes down. My father took his seat across from Jessica. Thomas moved with a slow, deliberate calmness. He rested his hands on the table, interlacing his fingers. He looked like a kind, retired grandfather ready to enjoy a holiday meal, but I knew better. I knew that posture. It was the exact posture he used when he was about to dismantle a fraudulent tax return line by line. I took the final empty seat at the opposite end of the table, placing myself directly in David's line of sight. David immediately reached for the bottle of Cabernet I had purchased for the occasion. It was a $90 bottle. I had agonized over that purchase, justifying the expense, because I thought tonight was the night we were saving our marriage. He uncorked it with practiced ease and poured a generous glass for Jessica before filling his own. He did not pour one for me. Jessica picked up the crystal glass by the bowl, warming the expensive wine with her hand, a detail that immediately annoyed my practical sensibilities. She took a slow sip, swished it around in her mouth, and let out a soft, dismissive sigh. "It is a bit young, isn't it?" Jessica said, setting the glass back down with a tiny clink. "I usually prefer a bolder vintage, something with a bit more oak. But I suppose it will do for tonight." David chuckled nervously, shooting me a quick warning glance. He wanted me to remain silent. He wanted me to absorb the insult and play the gracious hostess. I simply smiled, picking up my own empty water glass. "I am so sorry the wine is not up to your usual standards, Jessica," I said, my voice completely smooth and devoid of sarcasm. David picked it out. He always had a rather rushed palate. David cleared his throat loudly, his face flushing a dull red. He reached for the serving spoon resting in the bowl of garlic mashed potatoes. Before he could scoop a portion onto his plate, Jessica reached over and placed her manicured hand directly over his. "Oh, David absolutely hates garlic in his mashed potatoes," Jessica announced to the entire table. Her voice was dripping with that sickly sweet territorial possessiveness that mistresses use when they want to mark their territory. "You do not want that, do you, babe? It gives you terrible heartburn." The word babe hung in the air like a dropped plate shattering on a tile floor. David froze completely. The fake charming smile instantly dropped from his face. He looked at Jessica with wide, panicked eyes, then his gaze snapped to me, waiting for the explosion. He knew he had slipped. He knew she had crossed an undeniable line. A stranded junior associate whose flight got canceled does not call her boss babe at a holiday dinner with his wife. She does not know about his heartburn. She does not casually dictate his dietary preferences. I felt a sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, but I forced my heart rate to remain steady. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin down. I simply reached across the table, took the serving spoon from his frozen hand, and placed a massive scoop of the potatoes onto my own plate. "How incredibly thoughtful of you to remember his dietary restrictions, Jessica," I said, meeting her gaze with a perfectly pleasant expression. Good administrative assistants are so hard to find these days. Jessica's jaw tightened. The insult landed exactly where I wanted it to. She opened her mouth to snap back, but my father smoothly intercepted the conversation before the tension could escalate into an open argument. Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at Jessica with an expression of mild, polite curiosity. So Jessica, Thomas began his tone remarkably warm and conversational. "Claire tells me you are a junior associate at David's commercial brokerage. That must be a fascinating field to get into right now. The commercial real estate market in Chicago is notoriously brutal for newcomers. How long have you been in the industry?" Jessica immediately bristled at the term junior associate. Her massive ego could not handle being minimized, especially after my comment about administrative assistants. She took the bait exactly as my father knew she would. She sat up straighter, adjusting the strap of her silk dress, making sure the $12,000 sapphire pendant caught the light again. "Actually, Thomas, I am not really a junior associate," Jessica said, her tone laced with arrogant condescension. "That is just what David calls me when we are dealing with traditional clients who do not understand modern corporate structures. I am actually a managing partner in our new acquisitions division. I handle the high-level portfolios." David let out a sharp, awkward cough. He reached for his wine glass and took a massive gulp, his eyes darting frantically between my father and his mistress. "Jess, I do not think Thomas is interested in the boring details of our corporate structuring," David interrupted quickly. "Let us just enjoy Claire's lovely dinner. The prime rib looks fantastic." "Oh, I am very interested," David Thomas said, not looking away from Jessica for a single second. "I spent 35 years working for the Internal Revenue Service. I have a deep appreciation for the complexities of corporate structuring. Please, Jessica, tell me more. It is incredibly impressive for someone of your age to be a managing partner. You must handle some very significant capital." Jessica smiled, completely blind to the trap closing around her. She loved the attention. She loved feeling superior. She cut a small piece of her prime rib and leaned toward my father, eager to brag about her non-existent brilliance. "It takes a specific kind of vision," she explained, waving her fork dismissively. "Most people just look at standard commercial leases. David and I focus on aggressive acquisition and holding companies. We find properties that other people overlook, secure the capital, and transfer the assets into private portfolios. We actually just closed on a massive residential property last month. It is a completely brilliant strategy. We are practically printing money." I sat quietly at the end of the table, cutting my meat with slow, deliberate strokes of my knife. She had no idea what she was confessing to. She was sitting in my house, eating my food, wearing jewelry bought with my money, and openly bragging to a retired federal auditor about the exact financial fraud they were committing. She was arrogant. She was entitled, and she was spectacularly stupid. I watched the way she spoke, the way she moved her hands, completely convinced she was the smartest person in the room. It was a flawless demonstration of toxic entitlement built entirely on a foundation of stolen money. Thomas nodded slowly, chewing a bite of his dinner with measured precision. He swallowed, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and smiled a cold, calculating smile. "Aggressive acquisition," Thomas repeated, tasting the words. "That is a very bold strategy, Jessica, especially in this current economic climate. You must have to do an incredible amount of market research before you commit that kind of capital, particularly when you are dealing with high-end residential properties in the downtown sector." "Absolutely," Jessica agreed confidently. "You have to know exactly what you are buying. You have to know the building, the neighborhood, the exact value of the square footage. David and I do extensive hands-on research before we move a single dollar into a holding company." My father leaned back in his chair. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid slowly. "Extensive hands-on research," Thomas mused softly. I suppose that explains why the two of you have been spending so much time at 400 East Randolph Street. The entire dining room went dead silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. A heavy branch scraped against the living room window outside. David froze. His fork halted exactly halfway between his plate and his mouth. A piece of roasted meat fell off the prongs and hit the porcelain with a loud, wet smack. He did not move. He did not blink. All the blood rushed out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. I knew that address. Everyone in Chicago who pays attention to real estate knows that address. It is a highly exclusive, ultra-luxury condominium building overlooking Millennium Park. It is the kind of building where entry-level units start at $2 million. It is not a commercial strip mall. It is not a warehouse. It is a residential playground for the incredibly wealthy. And it was the exact property David had used as a fictional collateral excuse to justify the $300,000 bridge loan he forced me to sign. David Thomas said, his voice dropping the polite conversational tone entirely. It became sharp, authoritative, and terrifyingly precise. How is the market research going on, Unit 42B? That is a rather spectacular penthouse for a struggling commercial brokerage to acquire, is it not? Especially one facing such severe liquidity issues that it required a desperate secondary mortgage on your marital home. David slowly lowered his fork. His hand was shaking violently. A bead of sweat broke out along his hairline, catching the light from the chandelier. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of his expensive suits and his arrogant confidence. He was just a fraud caught in the glaring light of truth. Thomas. I think there has been a misunderstanding, David stammered. His voice was incredibly weak. The boisterous, confident broker from the foyer was completely gone. That property is a confidential corporate holding. It is part of a complex investment strategy that I cannot discuss due to client privacy agreements. We are just holding the deed temporarily while the escrow clears. Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. Client privacy agreements, Thomas repeated. That is a fascinating defense, David. I suppose that is why you registered the deed under a shell company. I suppose that is why you forged Claire's signature on the home equity line of credit to secure the down payment without her knowledge. And I suppose that is why your managing partner here has been claiming Unit 42B as her primary residential address for the last 2 months. Jessica dropped her wine glass. The crystal shattered against her dinner plate, sending dark red wine spilling across the crisp white tablecloth like a widening pool of blood. She looked wildly at David, her perfectly curated face twisting into sheer panic. I sat at the end of the table, watching the wine drip off the edge of the mahogany wood onto the floor. My heart was pounding a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. The suffocating tension was broken. The trap had been sprung perfectly. My father had laid the bait, and they had walked right into it, completely blind to their own impending destruction. The polite dinner was officially over. The execution had begun. I picked up the heavy silver carving knife and the long, 2-pronged meat fork. The blade was freshly sharpened, gleaming coldly under the dining room chandelier. I brought the utensils down to the massive cut of prime rib, resting on the ceramic serving platter in the center of the mahogany table. The exterior of the roast was perfectly crusted with salt and cracked black pepper, completely masking the dark, rare center inside. It was a perfect metaphor for my entire marriage. A beautiful, carefully maintained outer shell, hiding something bloody and raw underneath. I pressed the fork into the meat to steady it. The silence that had descended over the dining room after my father dropped the address of the luxury condominium was absolute. I drew the sharp edge of the carving knife across the top of the roast. The steel slid through the thick meat with a soft, wet sound. Red juice immediately began to pool at the bottom of the white porcelain platter. I kept my face entirely blank, focusing all of my attention on carving perfectly even slices exactly 1/4 inch thick, just the way David always demanded. David was sitting frozen to my left. I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing over the scraping of my knife. He was staring at my father with the wild, cornered look of an animal that had just heard the trap snap shut in the dark. The flush of wine and arrogant confidence had completely drained from his cheeks. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a small muscle twitched furiously near his temple. He needed to say something. He needed to deflect. He needed to take control of the narrative before Jessica started asking questions about why a retired government auditor knew the exact location of their secret love nest. David finally cleared his throat, pushing his shoulders back and puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to manufacture authority. He let out a harsh, patronizing laugh that echoed awkwardly off the dining room walls. "You are incredibly misinformed, Thomas," David said. His voice was louder than necessary, forcefully echoing his typical sales pitch bravado. "You are pulling random addresses out of thin air. We do not own any property at 400 East Randolph Street. I think your old age is making you confuse your public records. I am managing a massive commercial transition downtown. It involves complex zoning laws and holding trusts. It is far beyond the scope of a simple residential condo." My father did not flinch at the insult. He simply reached out and picked up his water glass, taking a slow, measured sip. He placed the crystal glass back onto the linen coaster with deliberate care. "I see," Thomas replied, his tone remaining perfectly pleasant and conversational. "So the $300,000 bridge loan that you required Claire to co-sign last month was solely for commercial zoning disputes." "That is fascinating, David. In my 35 years of auditing corporate tax returns, I have rarely seen a commercial brokerage demand a personal home equity line of credit from a spouse to cover operational zoning fees. Usually a successful firm leverages its own business assets. But then again, I am just a retired civil servant. Please enlighten me on how you plan to amortize a $300,000 personal debt through a commercial shell company." I pressed the blade down, severing another thick slice of the prime rib. The knife hit the ceramic platter with a sharp clink. I slid the meat onto a serving plate and passed it down the table to Jessica. She took it with a hesitant, confused smile, her eyes darting between my father and David. She could sense the hostility in the room, but she was entirely too arrogant to understand that she was standing in the crossfire. David slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table, making the silverware rattle against the china. His face contorted into a mask of ugly defensive rage. He absolutely hated being questioned about money. He hated feeling intellectually inferior. And most of all, he hated being challenged by my father. "Thomas, this is high-level commercial finance. It is not a tax audit." David snapped, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You spent your entire pathetic career sitting behind a gray metal desk looking at basic income forms. You do not understand how real wealth is generated in this city. You do not understand capital leverage. My firm moves millions of dollars in acquisitions every single quarter. Sometimes an aggressive buyer has to secure rapid liquidity to bypass traditional banking delays. I asked Claire to co-sign that loan because we are partners. Because when my ship comes in, she benefits. I am trying to build an empire for this family, and you are sitting here interrogating me like I am some kind of common criminal." I stopped carving. I kept my eyes fixed on the bloody juices pooling on the white platter. He was invoking the concept of our partnership. He was weaponizing the very vows we took to justify his actions. I felt a cold, calculated calm wash over my entire body. The weeping, desperate wife who had spent all morning crying over her ruined marriage was completely gone. The payroll manager was fully online. Jessica took a sip of her expensive Cabernet. She swallowed the wine and set the glass down, her chest puffing up with misguided pride. She had watched David belittle my father, and she clearly felt it was her duty to jump in and defend her brilliant, wealthy boss. She wanted to prove to this boring suburban family that David was a master of the universe and that she was his indispensable right-hand woman. She had absolutely no idea she was tightening the noose around his neck. "David is being entirely too modest," Jessica chimed in. Her voice was bright, musical, and utterly insufferable. "You really cannot judge his methods by traditional standards, Thomas. David is an absolute visionary. He knows exactly how to attract and maintain the best talent in the Chicago real estate market. In fact, he just secured a stunning new residential property exclusively for his top-tier staff. It is an innovative retention strategy. My hand tightened around the handle of the carving knife. The heavy silver metal dug into my palm. I turned my head very slowly and looked at Jessica. She was beaming at David, her eyes wide with adoration. David looked like he was about to vomit directly onto his dinner plate. He was staring at Jessica with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to raise his hand to stop her from speaking, but he was completely paralyzed by panic. "A residential property for top-tier staff?" My father repeated, gently encouraging her to keep talking. "That sounds incredibly generous." "Oh, it is absolutely breathtaking," Jessica bragged, completely ignoring David's horrified expression. She reached up and touched the $12,000 sapphire pendant resting on her collarbone, a subconscious gesture of pure vanity. "It is a corner penthouse unit, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Millennium Park. Custom marble countertops, a massive soaking tub in the master bath, and a private rooftop terrace. David says that creating a luxury environment for his key executives is the only way to inspire top performance. The holding company covers all the maintenance fees. It is the ultimate corporate perk." I looked down at the knife in my hand. The blade was slick with grease and blood. My brain, trained to analyze discrepancies in massive financial ledgers, suddenly snapped every single disjointed piece of the puzzle together into one blinding, horrifying picture. The pieces aligned with mathematical precision in the dark space behind my eyes. 4 months ago, David charged $12,000 to my personal credit card. He claimed it was a life-or-death legal retainer to save his commercial brokerage from a rival lawsuit. I paid that bill with my own emergency savings. Tonight, Jessica walked into my house wearing a custom-cut sapphire and diamond pendant. The exact same pendant I had pointed out to David in an Oak Street jewelry store 14 months ago. The price tag on that necklace was exactly $12,000. 6 weeks ago, David called me in the middle of our trial separation. He claimed his business was facing a massive liquidity crisis because his capital was frozen in a downtown escrow account. He begged me to co-sign a new joint mortgage on our home, a $300,000 bridge loan to save his company from bankruptcy. I signed the towering stack of legal documents in our living room with a mobile notary present. 2 minutes ago, my father dropped the address of an ultra-luxury condominium building located at 400 East Randolph Street. And right now, this 26-year-old blonde woman was happily describing a corner penthouse unit overlooking Millennium Park, bragging about the soaking tub and the floor-to-ceiling windows that her visionary boss had secured for her as a corporate perk. The equation was terrifyingly simple. There was no rival lawsuit. There was no commercial zoning dispute. There was no temporary bridge loan to save a struggling brokerage. David did not take out a business loan. He took out a massive home equity line of credit against the house I had spent 5 years helping him pay for. He brought a mobile notary to my living room and buried a secondary property deed authorization inside a stack of standard banking disclosures. He rushed me through the signing process, manipulating my guilt over our separation, and I trusted him completely. I signed exactly where he told me to sign. He used my pristine credit score, the equity in my home, and my forged authorization to buy a luxury penthouse condo for his mistress. He disguised the purchase through a shell company to hide the asset from our marital estate, and he listed Jessica as the managing partner so she could live there for free. He used my life savings to buy her diamonds, and he used my home equity to buy her $1 million view of the Chicago skyline. He made me finance his affair. The sheer audacity of the crime was so staggering, so deeply sociopathic, that I actually felt a brief hysterical urge to laugh. I had spent 12 hours in a sweltering kitchen blistering my hands and agonizing over the internal temperature of a roast beef, desperately trying to prove to this man that I was a good wife. I had spent 3 months crying myself to sleep analyzing every single conversation we ever had, wondering if I had been too focused on my job, wondering if I had somehow failed to nurture his ambitions. I did not fail his ambitions. I funded them. I was the bank. I was the silent, obedient, gullible bank that he used to build a fantasy life with a younger woman. I looked at David. He was no longer looking at my father or at Jessica. He was looking directly at me. He saw the realization dawn in my eyes. He saw the exact second my heart finally hardened into stone. He knew that I knew. His chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. The arrogant commercial broker was gone. In his place was a pathetic, greedy coward who realized he was sitting in a room with a woman who controlled the entirety of his legal and financial exposure. Claire, David whispered. His voice was trembling barely more than a breath of sound. It was the voice of a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows listening to the lever being pulled. Claire, please. Let me explain the corporate structure to you. You are misunderstanding the asset allocation. I did not answer him immediately. I set the silver carving knife down on the white porcelain platter. The heavy metal handle landed with a dull final thud. I reached into the pocket of my dark green dress and pulled out a small linen handkerchief. I carefully wiped the grease and the prime rib juices off my fingers, folding the cloth with meticulous, terrifying precision. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Jessica had finally stopped talking. She was looking back and forth between David and me, her perfectly manicured hands hovering nervously over her plate. The bright, confident arrogance had vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden dawning confusion. She was slowly realizing that the narrative David had fed her was unraveling in real time. She thought she was attending a dinner with a bitter, estranged wife. She was beginning to suspect she had walked into an execution. My father sat back in his chair. He did not say a single word. He simply watched me. He had laid the trap, he had forced the confession out of Jessica, and now he was handing the reins entirely over to me. This was my house. This was my marriage. This was my retribution to claim. I finished wiping my hands and placed the handkerchief neatly beside my water glass. I picked up my wine, the $90 Cabernet I had bought to celebrate our reconciliation. I took a slow, deep sip, letting the dark, heavy flavor coat my tongue. I swallowed, set the glass down, and turned my full, undivided attention to the woman wearing my diamonds. Jessica, I said. My voice did not shake. It was perfectly level, projecting the kind of cold corporate authority I used when terminating a fraudulent vendor account at work. That is an incredibly beautiful necklace. The sapphire is quite stunning. Jessica blinked, entirely thrown off balance by the sudden pivot in conversation. She reached up and touched the pendant again, a nervous, defensive gesture. Thank you, she stammered, her voice losing all of its previous musicality. Like I said, it was a gift. I know, I replied smoothly. I recognized the setting immediately. It is a custom piece from a private jeweler on Oak Street. Retail price $12,000. Jessica's eyes widened. She glanced at David, looking for an explanation, but David was staring at his plate like a dead man. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the dining room like a scalpel. You see, Jessica, my husband is a very generous man. He wanted to make sure you felt valued as a top-tier staff member. He was so dedicated to your happiness that he charged that exact $12,000 necklace to my personal Visa card 4 months ago. I paid the balance out of my emergency savings account because he told me he was facing a life-ruining lawsuit and needed a legal retainer. Jessica gasped, her hand flying away from the necklace as if the diamonds had suddenly burned her skin. Her jaw dropped open. She stared at me, then turned to stare at David, absolute horror washing over her perfectly made-up face. But his generosity did not stop there, I added, pushing myself up from my chair. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the two people who had destroyed my life. I rested my hands on the mahogany wood, leaning forward. I understand you are enjoying the floor-to-ceiling windows at your new penthouse on East Randolph Street, I said. It must be wonderful to have your maintenance fees covered by the holding company. But I think you should know the truth about your visionary boss. David does not own a successful commercial brokerage, Jessica. David is drowning in debt. That penthouse was not purchased with corporate profits. It was purchased with a $300,000 home equity line of credit that David secretly attached to the mortgage of the house you are currently sitting in. He used my credit history and forged my signature to buy your apartment. David shot up from his chair so fast it tipped over backwards, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a deafening bang. Shut up, he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer unfiltered panic. "Shut your mouth right now, Claire. You are hysterical. You do not know what you are talking about. You are ruining everything." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but pity and profound disgust. "I am not ruining anything, David," I said coldly. "I am just balancing the ledger." The echo of David screaming at me to shut up bounced violently against the dining room walls. The silence that immediately followed was suffocating. I did not flinch. I did not recoil. For 5 entire years of my life, whenever David raised his voice to that specific commanding register, I would physically shrink. I would apologize. I would scramble to fix whatever invisible mistake I had supposedly made to upset him. I was conditioned to believe that his anger was always a direct result of my inadequacy. But right then, looking at his red face, his twitching jaw, and his completely panicked eyes, the spell definitively broke. I uncurled my fingers from the heavy silver handle of the carving knife. I placed the blade gently onto the porcelain platter. The metal made a soft ringing sound against the ceramic. It was the absolute sound of my polite hostess facade permanently shattering. I took a deep, steadying breath. The rich scent of roasted rosemary and garlic, which had consumed my entire day, and my every waking thought, now just smelled like a ridiculous, tragic waste of time. I turned my head away from my husband. I looked directly at the young woman sitting in my chair. Jessica was frozen. Her large eyes darted rapidly between David and me. The smug territorial arrogance she had paraded through my front door was entirely gone. She was clutching her expensive linen napkin like a life preserver in a storm. She did not understand the intricate financial warfare currently happening in front of her, but she possessed enough basic survival instinct to know the ground was suddenly giving way beneath her expensive stiletto heels. I kept my voice perfectly even. "Jessica," I said. My tone was so mild and conversational that it made David visibly flinch. "How long exactly have you lived at Unit 42B? Jessica swallowed hard. Her gaze shifted to David, desperately seeking permission to speak, or a cue on how to answer. But David was too busy hyperventilating to give her a signal. His hands were gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Left without a script, Jessica's naive desire to validate her own importance completely overrode her caution. 2 months, she answered, her voice trembling slightly, lacking all of its previous musicality. We moved in right after Halloween. David said it was a corporate lease for key executives. He said the board of directors approved the acquisition specifically for our division. 2 months, right after Halloween. My analytical brain instantly pulled up the mental ledger of my own financial ruin. Late October was exactly when David had brought the mobile notary to our living room. It was the exact same week he had paced the hardwood floor in tears, claiming his commercial brokerage was collapsing. He had begged me to co-sign the $300,000 bridge loan. I had signed away my financial security while the autumn leaves were falling outside our bay window. I had comforted him. I had told him we would survive the debt together. And mere days later, he had handed Jessica the keys to a luxury penthouse overlooking Millennium Park. The timeline was immaculate. The cruelty was absolutely breathtaking. He had not just made a terrible financial mistake. He had orchestrated a highly coordinated, deliberate extraction of my wealth to fund his double life. Jessica thought she was defending David by proving he was a successful, generous provider. She was actually providing the exact verbal testimony needed to drive the final nail into his coffin. David could not handle the quiet realizations settling over the room. He needed chaos to hide his guilt. He kicked his heavy dining chair backward. The wooden legs scraped violently against the hardwood floor, emitting a loud, jarring screech. He stood up, towering over the dining table, trying to reclaim the physical dominance he had always relied on to win our arguments. "You are completely out of your mind, Claire." He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face. "This is exactly why I left you 3 months ago. You are totally paranoid. You are suffocating. You take a standard, highly complex business arrangement and you twist it into some insane conspiracy theory because you have absolutely no idea how the real world works. He was deploying the exact manipulative tactics he had used against me for half a decade. It was classic gaslighting. Deny the reality happening right in front of my eyes. Project his own guilt onto my reaction. Attack my sanity to invalidate my questions. Make me feel small, uneducated, and entirely responsible for his terrible behavior. He slammed his flat palm down on the mahogany table, making the remaining crystal glasses rattle. I came here tonight to give you another chance, Claire. I came here to try and save this marriage. But you just cannot help yourself, can you? You had to bring your miserable retired father into this to interrogate me. You had to embarrass me in front of my own staff. You are a bitter, calculating woman who ruins every good thing I try to build. His voice grew louder, filling the room with manufactured outrage. I am out there killing myself to provide for our future. I am out there navigating multi-million-dollar acquisitions, and you are sitting here in the suburbs obsessing over a necklace in a corporate housing unit you do not even understand. You are so obsessed with your boring little payroll spreadsheets that you cannot comprehend visionary success. Jessica shrank back into her chair, her eyes wide with terror. She had clearly never seen this side of David before. The charming, wealthy benefactor had vanished, replaced by a desperate, screaming tyrant. She was slowly realizing that the man she thought she knew was entirely a fiction. David leaned across the table, his face a mask of pure venom. I am done. Do you hear me? I am absolutely done playing these games with you. I am walking out that door and I'm calling my lawyer in the morning. You can keep this house. You can keep your little job. But I am leaving and you are going to be paying off that $300,000 business loan all by yourself for the rest of your miserable life. Let us go, Jessica. He fully expected me to break. He expected his ultimate threat of abandonment and financial ruin to crush my spirit. He was waiting for the familiar tears to well up in my eyes. He was waiting for my chest to heave with panicked sobs. He was waiting for me to stand up, run around the table, and beg him not to leave. He wanted me to abandon my own reality, apologize for asking questions, and comfort his fragile ego. That was the dance we had done 100 times before, but the tears never came. The emotional well inside me was completely dry. The sorrow, the anxiety, and the desperate, pathetic hope that had kept me tethered to this man for 5 years burned away in a matter of seconds. What replaced it was a pure, crystalline rage. It was a beautiful, brilliant clarity that sharpened my vision and slowed my racing heartbeat down to a calm, steady rhythm. I did not see a husband standing at the end of my table anymore. I saw a thief. I saw a parasitic coward who had fed on my loyalty and my paycheck. He was threatening to leave me with the debt he had forged in my name, assuming I was too timid and too submissive to fight back. He believed my love for him made me stupid. He was wrong. My love had made me blind, but my eyes were wide open now. I did not say a single word to David. I did not attempt to argue with his lies. I did not defend my sanity or my career. Engaging with his accusations would only validate his delusion that he still held power over me. Instead, I slowly turned my gaze across the table. My father had not moved a single muscle during David's entire explosive tantrum. Thomas had sat perfectly still, his hands folded patiently on the white tablecloth, watching the man who had abused his daughter completely unravel. He looked completely unaffected by David's screaming. To a man who had spent his life dismantling aggressive corporate tax evaders, David's outburst was just the predictable, pathetic flailing of a guilty man caught in a lie. When my eyes met his, Thomas offered a very small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent communication between us. The time for polite, investigative conversation was officially over. The trap had effectively snared its prey. It was time to drop the hammer. Thomas reached inside the breast pocket of his thick wool cardigan. He pulled out the plain manila folder he had carried into the kitchen earlier. He moved with slow, deliberate precision. He placed the folder onto the center of the mahogany table, right next to the fine china, the dripping carving knife, and the silver gravy boat. The heavy stack of papers landed with a solid, undeniable thud that echoed through the sudden silence of the dining room. He flipped the cardboard cover open, exposing a thick stack of bank statements, highlighted ledgers, and official property deeds. The physical evidence was finally exposed under the warm glow of the chandelier. The abstract threat had suddenly become concrete reality waiting to destroy David's entire life. The thick cardboard cover of the folder hit the mahogany table with a heavy, undeniable thud. My father did not rush. He opened the file with the careful, practiced movements of a man who had spent 3 decades dismantling the financial lives of white-collar criminals. He did not look at David. He did not look at Jessica. He looked entirely at the documents as he began to extract them one by one. First, he pulled out a stack of bank statements printed on crisp white paper. He laid them out in a neat row right next to the silver gravy boat. Then came a series of wire transfer receipts, their transaction numbers highlighted in bright yellow ink. Finally, he produced the most damning piece of paper of all. It was the certified deed to Unit 42B at 400 East Randolph Street. He placed it directly in the center of the table, perfectly aligned beneath the glow of the chandelier. I looked down at the documents. As a payroll manager, numbers speak to me. They form a language that tells the absolute truth regardless of what lies. A person tries to wrap around them. The story laid out on my dining room table was a masterpiece of financial deception, and my father was about to read it aloud to the entire room. Thomas pointed a steady finger at the first row of bank statements. He began to explain step by step how David had systematically drained our marital assets. But it was not just our shared savings. Thomas traced the exact routing numbers showing how David had intercepted direct deposits from my own personal payroll account. My husband had secretly altered my deposit forms, funneling a portion of my salary through a secondary external account before the rest ever hit my primary ledger. He had been quietly skimming my paycheck for over a year. I felt a sickening cold wash over my arms. I had trusted him to handle the routing updates when my logistics firm switched banking systems. That trust had been the key to my own robbery. Then Thomas unveiled the home equity line of credit application. He slid the heavy packet of papers across the polished wood toward me. I looked at the bottom line on the final page. My signature was resting there in blue ink. It was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. Thomas explained how David had used that $300,000 loan secured entirely against the house I was currently sitting in to cover the massive cash down payment on the luxury penthouse. He had brought a mobile notary into our home under the disguise of a simple refinancing agreement, slipping the fraudulent authorization into a towering stack of mundane disclosures. But a penthouse in that building cost far more than $300,000. The monthly maintenance fees alone were exorbitant. I looked at my father, waiting for the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Thomas delivered it without a single ounce of mercy. He revealed the darkest layer of the entire operation. David had been heavily commingling funds. My father produced a secondary ledger outlining David's professional commercial real estate accounts. My husband was actively embezzling earnest money deposits from his own clients. He was taking the capital that investors trusted him to hold in escrow, and he was illegally transferring it into the shell company registered in Jessica's name. That stolen client money was paying the monthly mortgage on their romantic hideaway. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. David had built a house of cards using my forged signature as the foundation and stolen investor capital as the walls. David could no longer hide behind his charming, tailored broker persona. The realization that his entire secret empire was documented on my dining room table pushed him completely over the edge. His face morphed from a mask of terrified panic into a portrait of pure, unadulterated hatred. The flush of the wine returned to his cheeks, turning his skin a mottled shade of crimson. He slammed both of his hands flat onto the table, making the fine china jump. He screamed at my father to shut up, demanding that he close the folder immediately. When Thomas completely ignored him and simply took another sip of his water, David turned his venom entirely on me. "You think you are so smart?" David spat, his voice echoing violently off the walls. "You think bringing your retired pension-collecting father into my business matters makes you powerful? You are absolutely pathetic, Claire. You are nothing but a glorified secretary. The words flew out of his mouth like toxic darts. He paced back and forth behind his chair, his hands running frantically through his perfectly styled hair. He ranted about how he was the true breadwinner of our household, despite the fact that I had just seen the proof that my salary was keeping him afloat. He screamed that he was destined for greatness, that he possessed a visionary mind while I was content punching numbers into a calculator for a mediocre logistics firm in the suburbs. "I carried you for 5 years," he yelled, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. "I gave you a life. I gave you status. You owe me everything you have. You could never understand the kind of pressure I am under to succeed in a real industry. You sit in a cubicle. I build skylines. I took that equity because it belonged to me. I earned it by putting up with your boring, small-minded anxiety. I sat perfectly still, absorbing every single insult without flinching. The man I had loved, the man I had spent 12 agonizing hours cooking a holiday meal for, was finally showing me his true soul. There was no remorse. There was no apology for the profound betrayal. There was only a furious, narcissistic rage that he had been caught. He truly believed he was entitled to steal from me because he viewed me as a lesser human being. While David continued his aggressive tirade, I watched the young woman sitting to his right. Jessica was staring at the forged documents and the highlighted wire transfers with wide, horrified eyes. The arrogant smirk she had worn into my home had completely dissolved. The color had drained so rapidly from her face that she looked physically ill. She was finally putting the pieces together. She had believed she was dating a brilliant, wealthy commercial broker who was lavishing her with gifts from his massive success. She was realizing right now that she was actually tied to a broke, fraudulent criminal. More importantly, she was looking at the incorporation documents for the shell company. She saw her own signature listed as the primary managing partner. She understood that David had not just bought her an apartment. He had legally anchored her to a massive embezzlement scheme involving stolen client funds. Panic, raw and unfiltered, set in. Jessica pushed her chair back from the table. The wooden legs screeched loudly against the floorboards. She stood up, wrapping her arms defensively around her stomach. "I had absolutely no idea where that money came from," Jessica declared loudly, her voice trembling with rising hysteria. She physically backed away from David, treating him like he was suddenly contagious. David stopped pacing and stared at her, genuinely shocked by her sudden retreat. "Jess, do not do this right now," he warned, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. "We are a team. I did this for us." "Do not call me your team," she shrieked, her perfectly curated composure completely shattering. "You lied to me. You told me you were a multimillionaire. You told me you were already legally separated from a bitter, greedy wife who was trying to steal your assets. You said the shell company was a standard tax shield for your personal wealth. You never told me you were forging loan documents and stealing from your own clients." She looked at my father and me, her hands waving frantically in the air. "I swear to you, I did not know. I thought he was rich. I thought he was taking care of me. I am a victim here too. He manipulated me just like he manipulated you." I looked at the $12,000 custom sapphire pendant resting against her collarbone. I felt absolutely no sympathy for her. She had walked into my home fully prepared to mock my hospitality and assert her dominance over a woman she thought was weak. She was only playing the victim now because the money turned out to be stolen. David realized he was losing control of the room. His mistress was turning on him, his financial crimes were laid bare, and his wife was staring at him with cold, detached indifference. Desperation took over. He needed to destroy the evidence. He lunged across the dining table, his body knocking over the crystal wine glasses and sending the silver serving utensils scattering. He reached directly for the manila folder sitting near the gravy boat, his fingers grasping wildly for the forged deed and the bank ledgers. My father did not even stand up. Thomas simply placed his large, steady hand flat against the center of the documents. With a smooth, practiced motion, he slid the entire folder down the polished mahogany wood, stopping it safely at my end of the table, entirely out of David's reach. David lost his balance and caught himself on the edge of the table, his tailored suit jacket dipping directly into the pool of spilled red wine. He scrambled backward, wiping the dark red stain from his sleeve. His chest was heaving. He looked like a cornered rat trapped and frantic. But then a strange toxic shift occurred in his posture. He straightened his ruined jacket. He smoothed his hair back into place. The panic in his eyes slowly morphed into a nasty, incredibly confident sneer. He had remembered his ultimate trump card. He believed he still held the power to destroy me. He looked down the length of the table at me, his lip curling in absolute contempt. "You think you have won something here, Claire?" David taunted, his voice dropping into a slow, mocking cadence. "You think a few printed spreadsheets and some angry accusations are going to ruin me? You are so naive. You can never prove that I forged your signature on those loan documents. Mobile notaries make administrative mistakes all the time. Spouses authorize transactions verbally every single day. Good luck convincing a judge that you did not know what you were signing when your name is perfectly scripted on the bottom line." He leaned forward, resting his hands on his hips. "You are trapped, Claire. I am walking out of this house tonight. I am taking the car, and I am leaving you here to rot. You are legally bound to a $300,000 debt on a property you do not even possess. Good luck paying off that kind of liability on a simple bookkeeper's salary. They are going to foreclose on this house. They are going to garnish your wages. You are going to be bankrupt before the summer ends." The echo of David collapsing onto the hardwood floor reverberated through the dining room. He stayed on his knees, his hands covering his face, his breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. The $3,000 tailored suit he wore was wrinkled, stained with wine, and completely stripped of its power. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a small, greedy man who had finally run out of lies. I sat at the head of the table and looked down at him. For 5 years, I had bent myself into 1,000 different shapes to try and make this man happy. I had sacrificed my savings, my peace of mind, and my own self-respect to support a vision that was nothing but a mirage. I expected to feel a rush of sorrow seeing him so completely broken. I expected to feel the familiar tug of guilt, the urge to reach down and comfort him. But as I watched his shoulders heave with pathetic, selfish tears, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The love I had harbored for him was completely gone, surgically removed by the sheer scale of his betrayal. Jessica was the first to break the frozen tableau. Her phone was still vibrating relentlessly on the table, illuminating the dark wood with the incoming call from her furious father. The reality of her situation had finally crystallized in her mind. She was not the cherished girlfriend of a successful millionaire. She was the unwitting accomplice to a federal crime, caught wearing stolen diamonds and facing the wrath of a father whose private equity firm had just been robbed. She shot up from her chair, nearly knocking it backward into the wall. Her face was flushed with a mixture of terror and absolute fury. She looked down at David, who was still weeping into his hands on the floor. "You lied to me," she screamed, her voice piercing the quiet room like a siren. "You told me you were building an empire. You told me that Penthouse was a corporate perk. You used me to steal from my own father. You are disgusting. You are a complete pathetic fraud." David tried to reach up and grab the edge of her cashmere coat, his face red and stained with tears. "Jess, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to talk to Robert. You have to tell your father that I can fix this. I can move the capital. I just need time. Do not leave me. Do not touch me," she shrieked violently, pulling her coat out of his grasp. She picked up her half-empty crystal wine glass from the table. Without a second of hesitation, she hurled the dark red Cabernet directly at his face. The wine splashed across his pale cheeks, dripping down his neck and soaking into the crisp white collar of his expensive dress shirt. "I am going to let my father destroy you," Jessica hissed, her voice vibrating with pure venom. She turned around, grabbed her designer handbag from the floor, and sprinted out of the dining room. Her stiletto heels hammered furiously against the hardwood floor as she ran down the hallway. A moment later, the heavy oak front door slammed shut with a deafening crash, rattling the windows in their frames. She was gone. She had stormed out into the freezing Chicago snowstorm, leaving David entirely alone with the wreckage of his life. The silence that settled over the room after the door slammed was heavy and absolute. David stayed on his knees staring at the floorboards, the dark red wine dripping slowly from his chin onto his ruined suit jacket. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in erratic jerks. He had lost his mistress. He had lost his primary investor. He had lost his freedom. And then incredibly, he turned his pathetic, tear-streaked face toward me. He crawled forward a few inches on his knees, closing the distance between us until he was directly beside my chair. He reached out and wrapped his hands around my ankles. His grip was weak, trembling, and entirely desperate. "Claire," he wept, pressing his wet face against my knees. "Claire, I am so sorry. I lost my mind. The pressure of the business, the stress of the market, it made me crazy. I never meant to hurt you. I love you. You are my wife. We took vows. We promised for better or for worse. You have to help me. You have to tell Thomas to call the investigators and tell them it was all a misunderstanding about the loan. Please, Claire. I will do anything. I will go to counseling. I will sell the business. Just do not let them send me to prison." I looked down at the top of his head. I looked at the man who had spent the last 3 months telling me I was unsupportive, small-minded, and suffocating. I looked at the man who had forged my signature on a federal banking document to buy a luxury penthouse for a 26-year-old girl. I reached down and calmly pried his trembling hands off my ankles. I stood up from my chair, taking a slow step backward, completely removing myself from his physical grasp. "You do not get to invoke our vows, David," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any warmth. "You broke those vows the moment you stole my savings to buy her diamonds. You broke them the moment you forged my signature. You broke them every single time you looked me in the eye and blamed me for the failure of our marriage while you were actively planning your new life with my money." "But I am your husband," he sobbed, reaching out toward the hem of my dark green dress. "You cannot just throw me away. We spent 5 years together." I looked at him, feeling the final heavy chain of my emotional servitude break and fall away. "You threw me away." "David," I said quietly, "I am just officially accepting the terms of the separation." I walked over to the coat closet in the hallway. I pulled out his heavy charcoal gray overcoat. I walked back into the dining room and dropped the expensive wool coat directly onto his head. "Get up," I ordered, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that I had never used with him before. "Get up, put your coat on, and get out of my house. Your accounts are frozen. Your business is seized. You have absolutely nothing left here. I am sure you can find an Uber driver willing to take you to whatever cheap motel you can afford with the cash in your wallet." He scrambled to his feet, clutching his coat to his chest, his face twisted in pure, desperate disbelief. "You cannot do this. It is Christmas Eve. It is a blizzard out there. You are my wife." "I am the woman who is testifying against you in federal court," I corrected him, my eyes locking onto his with unwavering precision. "And if you are not out of my house in exactly 10 seconds, my father will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing before the federal agents even have a chance to indict you." David looked at me. He looked at my father, who was standing quietly by the table with his arms crossed, watching the eviction with a look of profound satisfaction. David knew it was over. He knew the manipulation would never work again. He turned around, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, and walked slowly toward the front door. He did not say another word. He stepped out into the freezing, howling snowstorm. I closed the heavy oak door behind him. I reached up and turned the deadbolt. The lock engaged with a loud, incredibly satisfying click. The parasite was finally gone. The next 6 months moved with breathtaking speed. The financial and legal fallout was massive, sweeping through David's life like a devastating hurricane. The federal authorities officially indicted him on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and forgery. The evidence my father had handed over was immaculate. The prosecution did not even need to offer him a plea deal. The shell company was dissolved. The luxury penthouse on East Randolph Street was seized and liquidated by the government to cover the stolen investor funds. Robert Sterling, furious over the embezzlement, completely dismantled David's commercial brokerage, pulling every single cent of his private capital. Jessica disappeared from the city, entirely allegedly moving out of state to escape the humiliation and the intense legal scrutiny surrounding her involvement in the shell company. Because the federal investigators had confirmed the home equity loan was secured through criminal forgery, the bank's fraud department officially cleared the liability from my name. I was completely indemnified. I owed absolutely nothing. With the debt erased and the forged documents nullified, my divorce proceedings moved incredibly fast. The judge granted my request for a total severance of assets. David, sitting in a courtroom in a cheap suit, facing years in a federal penitentiary, had absolutely no resources to fight me. I kept the house. I kept my savings. I kept my peace. At work, my ability to handle complex logistical audits and maintain absolute composure under pressure caught the attention of the executive board. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I was promoted to Regional Director of Operations. My salary doubled. I stopped buying discount groceries. I stopped apologizing for my practical nature. I realized that being dependable, analytical, and grounded was not a weakness. It was my greatest strength. It was the exact strength that had allowed me to survive the darkest betrayal of my life. I sold the house in the suburbs. It held too many ghosts, too many memories of anxious cooking and suffocating arguments. I took my promotion bonus and the equity from the sale and bought a beautiful, bright new townhouse closer to the city. It has massive windows, a quiet reading nook, and a modern kitchen where I only cook when I genuinely want to. Last night, my father came over for dinner. We did not have prime rib. We ordered takeout from a local Italian place, drank a very reasonably priced bottle of red wine, and sat comfortably on my new sofa. We laughed about old times. We talked about his retirement plans. We did not mention David. The tension, the anxiety, and the desperate need to prove my worth were completely gone. The air in my home felt light, safe, and entirely my own. I learned a very difficult lesson about the psychology of manipulation. Abusers will constantly use the concepts of loyalty, partnership, and family to trap you in a cycle of emotional servitude. They will convince you that your boundaries are selfish. They will convince you that their demands are just normal sacrifices you must make to prove your love. They will weaponize your best qualities against you, turning your reliability into a tool for their own extraction. But walking away is not a failure. Setting a hard, uncompromising boundary with someone who exploits you is the ultimate act of self-respect. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire to keep a liar warm. Your worth is not defined by how much abuse you can endure in the name of love. Your worth is defined by your absolute refusal to accept anything less than the truth. If you have ever had to unmask a liar or set a hard boundary with someone you once loved, I want to hear your story. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Take care of yourselves. You deserve it. The heavy mahogany table seemed to stretch out for miles, separating the wreckage of my past from the absolute clarity of my future. David was still staring blindly at the federal investigation report my father had just placed next to the gravy boat. His brain was completely unable to process the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. His jaw hung slightly open and the color had entirely vanished from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet ash. But the real explosion did not come from my husband. It came from the woman sitting in the chair next to him. Jessica was staring down at her mobile phone. The device was vibrating relentlessly against the polished wood, vibrating so hard it was slowly rotating in a small circle. The screen glowed brightly, illuminating the sheer, unadulterated panic setting into her features. I knew exactly who was calling her. My father had already confirmed that he had forwarded the entire meticulously compiled portfolio of David's embezzlement directly to Jessica's father, the primary investor David had been actively robbing for over a year. Jessica looked at the ringing phone. then slowly lifted her head to look at the man she had believed was a brilliant, wealthy commercial real estate visionary. The illusion was completely shattered. She was not staring at a titan of industry. She was staring at a cornered, penniless criminal who had just anchored her name to a massive federal fraud investigation. She pushed her heavy wooden dining chair backward with such violent force that it tipped over entirely, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. She leaped to her feet. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving as she backed away from the table. "You completely ruined my life," Jessica screamed. Her voice was not the musical, arrogant purr she had used when she walked through my front door. It was a harsh, terrified shriek that echoed off the vintage crown molding. "You lied to me about absolutely everything. You told me you were a multimillionaire. You told me you were building an empire for us. You used my name on those incorporation documents. You used my signature to steal from my own father." David snapped out of his catatonic shock. He reached a trembling hand out toward her, his face twisting into a pathetic mask of desperation. "Jess, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Please, you have to listen to me. We can fix this. You have to answer that phone and tell your father that it is a misunderstanding. I can move the capital around. I can make the accounts balance. I just need a little bit of time. Do not walk away from me. We are partners." The word partners seemed to act like a physical spark hitting a pool of gasoline. Jessica let out a sound that was half sob and half hysterical laugh. "We are not partners, you pathetic fraud," she yelled, her entire body shaking with rage. "You are going to federal prison and you are trying to drag me down with you. I thought you were a success. You are nothing but a cheap lying thief." She reached down and grabbed the stem of her crystal wine glass. It was still half full of the expensive Cabernet I had carefully selected for this dinner. Without a single moment of hesitation, she pulled her arm back and hurled the contents directly at David. The dark red liquid flew across the space between them in a violent arc. It splashed directly onto his face, covering his cheeks, his nose, and his forehead. The wine dripped down his chin and soaked instantly into the collar of his crisp, expensive white dress shirt, leaving a massive dark stain spreading across his chest like an open wound. David gasped, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes, but it was too late. He was dripping with wine, humiliated and completely exposed. Jessica did not even wait to see the aftermath of her throw. She spun around on her expensive stiletto heels and marched furiously out of the dining room. I listened to the rapid, aggressive clicking of her shoes against the hallway floorboards. I heard the rustle of fabric as she snatched her heavy designer coat from the front closet. A second later, the massive oak front door was wrenched open and slammed shut with a concussive boom that rattled the framed photographs on the living room walls. She was gone. She had fled out into the freezing, howling Chicago snowstorm, completely abandoning the man she had been clinging to all evening. The dining room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The smell of roasted garlic and rosemary still hung in the air, a cruel, mocking reminder of the polite holiday dinner I had spent my entire day preparing. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table. My father sat across from me, his hands folded neatly on the tablecloth, his expression a mask of calm, objective observation. David wiped the dripping wine from his eyes with the back of his trembling hand. He looked at the empty doorway where his mistress had just vanished. He looked at the federal fraud report sitting next to the gravy boat. He looked at the shattered remains of his arrogant, deceitful life. And then he looked at me. His legs simply gave out. David collapsed onto the floor. His knees hit the hardwood with a dull, heavy thud. He crawled around the corner of the long mahogany table, dragging himself across the floorboards until he was directly beside my chair. He reached out and wrapped his large hands tightly around my ankles. "Claire," he sobbed, his voice completely broken, stripped of every single ounce of the condescending authority he had wielded over me for 5 years. "Claire, please, you have to help me. I am so sorry." I lost my mind. The pressure of the business, the stress of the market, it made me crazy. "I did not mean to hurt you." He pressed his wet, wine-stained face against the fabric of my dark green dress. He was weeping uncontrollably, his shoulders heaving with violent, pathetic gasps. I looked down at the top of his head. This was the man who had systematically isolated me, manipulated my insecurities, and drained my bank accounts. This was the man who had looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing but a glorified secretary. This was the man who had brought his mistress into my home on Christmas Eve to flaunt his stolen wealth. For half a decade, whenever David raised his voice or showed the slightest hint of distress, I would panic. I would rush to comfort him. I would apologize for things I had not even done simply to restore the peace in our house. I expected to feel that familiar conditioned pull of sympathy right now. I expected to feel a twinge of sorrow seeing my husband on his knees, weeping like a frightened child. But as I stared down at him, I realized something profound and beautiful. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, agonizing well of emotional desperation that had kept me tied to him was completely dry. The love I had fought so hard to preserve had simply evaporated, burned away by the blinding light of the truth. I was looking at a stranger. "You are my wife." David begged, his fingers tightening around my ankles. "We took vows, Claire. We promised for better or for worse. You cannot just let them take me away. You have to tell Thomas to call the investigators. Tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. Tell them I had your verbal permission to use the home equity line of credit. If you just tell them we are working it out privately, they might drop the federal charges. Please, Claire, I will do anything you want. I will go to counseling. I will sell the brokerage. I will spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Just do not let me go to prison." His pleas echoed off the walls, pathetic and hollow. He was not sorry for what he had done to me. He was only sorry that he had been caught. He was still trying to use my sense of loyalty to save himself. He actually believed that after everything he had stolen, after every lie he had constructed, he could just invoke our marriage vows, and I would obediently fall back into line and protect him. I reached down with calm, steady hands and firmly pried his fingers off my ankles. I stood up from my dining chair, taking a slow step backward, completely removing myself from his physical grasp. I looked down at him, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely detached. "You do not get to invoke our vows, David," I said. My voice was low, incredibly steady, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You broke those vows the very first time you altered my direct deposit routing numbers to steal from my paycheck. You broke them when you forced me to drain my savings to buy her jewelry. You broke them when you sat at my table tonight and let her insult my home." I turned away from him and walked out of the dining room. I moved down the hallway with measured, deliberate steps. I opened the heavy wooden door of the front hall closet. The scent of damp wool and winter air drifted out. I reached in and pulled his expensive charcoal gray overcoat off its wooden hanger. I walked back into the dining room. David was still on his knees, his face red and swollen, looking up at me with an expression of sheer disbelieving panic. I dropped the heavy wool coat directly onto his shoulders. "Get up," I ordered. The tone of my voice was absolutely uncompromising. It was the voice of a woman who had just reclaimed complete ownership of her life. "Get up, put your coat on, and get out of my house." "Claire, you cannot do this," David stammered, scrambling clumsily to his feet. He clutched the coat against his chest, his eyes darting frantically around the room, as if searching for someone else to intervene. "You cannot kick me out. It is freezing outside. It is a blizzard. I do not have anywhere to go. My accounts are completely frozen. I cannot even book a hotel." I looked at him, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction settle into my bones. "That sounds like a logistical problem, David," I replied smoothly. "And since you just spent the last 20 minutes screaming about how I am nothing but a glorified secretary who does not understand complex problem-solving, I am fully confident a visionary such as yourself can figure out how to navigate the Chicago transit system with whatever loose cash you have left in your wallet." I gestured toward the hallway. "Your Uber is waiting, David. Or your taxi. Or your long walk to the nearest train station. I honestly do not care. But you are leaving this property right now." He stood there frozen, trying to find a way out of the inevitable. He looked at my father. Thomas simply raised his eyebrows, picked up his crystal water glass, and took another slow, silent sip. There was no mercy to be found in this room. David swallowed hard. His shoulders slumped in absolute total defeat. The reality of his situation had finally crushed his massive ego. He pulled his heavy wool coat over his wine-stained shirt, his hands trembling violently as he fumbled with the large black buttons. He turned away from the dining table, lowering his head, and began the long, humiliating walk down the hallway toward the front door. I followed closely behind him, ensuring he did not stop or attempt to linger. When we reached the foyer, he stopped with his hand on the brass doorknob. He turned his head slightly, looking back at me over his shoulder. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and profound loss. "Claire," he whispered, making one final pathetic attempt to elicit my sympathy. I reached past him, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door and pulled it wide open. A brutal gust of freezing snow-filled air rushed into the warm foyer, biting at my bare arms and sending a shiver down my spine. The storm outside was howling the wind, whipping the falling snow into violent swirling patterns under the glow of the streetlights. "Goodbye, David," I said. He stepped over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes sinking immediately into the accumulation of fresh snow on the front porch. The wind caught the lapels of his coat, whipping the fabric around his legs as he stumbled forward into the freezing night. He looked incredibly small, a pathetic, broken figure retreating into the dark storm he had brought entirely upon himself. I did not wait to watch him walk down the driveway. I grasped the heavy oak door and pushed it shut with both hands. The solid wood slammed into the doorframe with a heavy, definitive thud, instantly cutting off the howling sound of the winter wind. I reached up and grabbed the brass deadbolt. I turned it firmly to the right. The heavy metal mechanism engaged with a loud, sharp, incredibly satisfying click. The morning after Christmas felt entirely different than any morning I had experienced in the past 5 years. When I woke up and walked downstairs into the kitchen, the house was silent. It was not the anxious, suffocating silence of waiting for a volatile husband to wake up and criticize my efforts. It was the deep, resonant silence of absolute safety. The heavy snow from the night before was melting under a bright winter sun, and as I poured my coffee, I realized that the heavy, crushing weight I had carried in my chest since the day I married David was completely gone. Fast forward 6 months, and that initial morning of peace had blossomed into a completely unrecognizable life. The speed at which a fraudulent empire collapses is truly something to behold once the foundational lies are removed. My father had not simply collected those bank statements and property deeds to make a dramatic point at a dinner party. He had spent his entire career as a federal auditor, and he knew exactly which agencies to contact, which agents to speak with, and exactly how to package the evidence so that a federal investigation would be opened immediately. By the second week of January, David found his world entirely dismantled. Federal investigators descended on his commercial brokerage firm. They did not knock politely and ask for an appointment. They walked through his glass doors with official warrants, carrying out boxes of physical files and cloning every single hard drive in the office. They froze all of his business and personal accounts. The money he had carefully embezzled from his clients was completely locked down, inaccessible to him or his expensive defense attorneys. David was officially indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The prosecution laid out a meticulously documented case showing exactly how he had diverted funds from his own clients to finance his lavish double life. They traced the earnest money deposits he had stolen directly into the shell company he had created. They proved he had used that stolen capital to pay the exorbitant maintenance fees on the luxury penthouse overlooking Millennium Park. When the news of the indictment hit the local business journals, the fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Robert Sterling, the primary investor who had funded David's most lucrative projects, severed all ties immediately. Robert was a ruthless businessman who did not tolerate public humiliation, especially when it involved his own daughter. He pulled every single dollar of capital from the brokerage, triggering a chain reaction of panic among the other investors. Within 3 weeks, David's firm completely imploded. The sleek downtown office was vacated, the junior brokers jumped ship to save their own careers, and the company was forced into immediate liquidation. Jessica did exactly what a deeply entitled, self-serving accomplice does when the money dries up and the federal agents start asking questions. She vanished. She completely turned her back on the man she had called a visionary just weeks prior. Once she realized that David was not a wealthy titan of industry, but a broke criminal facing years in a federal penitentiary, her infatuation instantly evaporated. She packed her designer clothes, abandoned the penthouse, and moved back to the East Coast, desperate to distance herself from the radioactive crater of David's life. She left him entirely alone to face the consequences of the fraud they had enjoyed together. While David was drowning in a legal nightmare, I was methodically untangling myself from the wreckage he had left behind. Divorces involving massive financial fraud are usually agonizingly slow, but my situation was unique. Because David was fighting for his actual freedom in federal court, he had absolutely no leverage, no resources, and no fight left in him for family court. My father and I sat down with the fraud department at my bank to address the $300,000 home equity line of credit David had taken out against our house. We provided the timeline, the forensic evidence of the forgery, and the federal indictment report. Because the government had already proven that David committed aggravated identity theft to secure the loan, the bank had no choice but to clear the liability entirely from my name. The massive, terrifying debt that David had thrown in my face as his final threat was completely erased. I was indemnified. I owed them absolutely nothing. The judge overseeing our divorce granted my petition for a total severance of assets with remarkable speed. I kept the house. I kept my savings. I kept my retirement accounts. David walked away with nothing but his mounting legal fees and his impending prison sentence. The legal severing of our marriage was so surgical and clean that it felt less like a divorce and more like an exorcism. I had successfully excised a parasite from my financial and emotional life. With the personal chaos finally resolved, a sudden and massive surge of energy returned to my professional life. For years, I had allowed David to belittle my career. He had convinced me that managing payroll and logistics was boring, small-minded work, while his chaotic, high-risk gambling was the only true measure of success. But the crisis I had just survived taught me a profound lesson about my own capabilities. The exact skills that David had mocked were the very skills that saved my life. My meticulous attention to detail, my ability to remain perfectly calm under immense pressure, and my relentless demand for factual accuracy were not weaknesses. They were superpowers. I brought that renewed confidence directly into my office. When my logistics firm faced a massive restructuring challenge in the spring, I did not shrink into the background. I stepped forward. I identified over $1 million in supply chain inefficiencies, completely overhauling our vendor payment systems to prevent the exact kind of financial bleeding I had just witnessed in my personal life. The executive board took notice immediately. They saw a woman who operated with absolute clarity and unshakable resolve. In May, the company offered me a massive promotion. I was named the Regional Director of Operations. The new title came with a private office, a team of dedicated analysts, and a salary that more than doubled my previous income. I was no longer just the reliable payroll manager. I was a senior executive. I stopped buying my clothes on clearance. I stopped constantly calculating every penny I spent at the grocery store. I realized that I did not need a visionary husband to build wealth. I was perfectly capable of building my own empire, one honest, meticulously balanced ledger at a time. But the most beautiful triumph of all was the peace I finally found in my own environment. The sprawling suburban house I had shared with David was beautiful, but it was haunted. Every room held a memory of his aggressive lectures, his sudden volatile moods, and my own desperate attempts to placate him. I did not want to live inside a museum dedicated to my past mistakes. So I put the house on the market. It sold in under a week to a lovely young family. I took the equity from the sale, combined it with my new executive bonus, and bought a stunning townhouse much closer to the city center. It was everything the old house was not. It had massive floor-to-ceiling windows that let the morning sunlight pour across wide plank hardwood floors. It had a quiet, cozy reading nook overlooking a small private courtyard. And it had a beautiful modern kitchen where I knew I would never again stand over a hot stove for 12 hours, desperately trying to earn someone else's love. Last night, my father came over to the new townhouse for dinner. It was a warm, beautiful summer evening. We did not have a heavy, pretentious prime rib. I did not spend my entire day sweating and crying over complex side dishes. We simply ordered fantastic takeout from a local Italian restaurant down the street. I bought a very good, reasonably priced bottle of red wine, and we sat together at my small glass dining table. I watched my father take a sip of his wine and look around my new home. He looked incredibly proud. The tight protective tension that he had carried in his shoulders for the last 5 years was completely gone. We talked about his retirement plans, his garden, and my new team at the office. We laughed loudly and freely. We did not mention David. We did not mention the federal trial, the Mistress, or the stolen money. That dark chapter was firmly closed, sealed shut, and left in the past where it belonged. Sitting there in my beautiful, bright home, I realized what true safety actually feels like. True safety is not about having a husband who promises to protect you while secretly destroying you. It is about knowing that you can trust your own mind. It is about the absolute quiet of a home where no one is going to yell at you for buying the wrong brand of coffee or asking a simple question about a credit card bill. It is the profound, beautiful absence of fear. I used to believe that love required immense sacrifice. I believed that to be a good partner, I had to absorb my husband's anxiety fund, his dreams, and completely erase my own needs to make room for his ego. I thought boundaries were selfish. I thought holding someone accountable was a betrayal of loyalty. But I learned the hard way that toxic, narcissistic people rely entirely on your goodness to fund their darkness. They will use your sense of duty as a weapon against you. They will drain your bank accounts, insult your intelligence, and demand your absolute submission, all while convincing you that you are the one failing the relationship. They do not want a partner. They want a host. Walking away from that dynamic is not a failure. Dropping the polite facade and looking a liar directly in the eye is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You are never obligated to protect the reputation of someone who is actively trying to destroy your life. You have every right to gather your evidence, lock your doors, and let the house of cards collapse entirely on top of the person who built it. Your worth is not measured by how much deception you can endure. It is measured by your courage to finally say enough. I am 28 years old now. I am sitting in a home I paid for with my own money, working a job I earned with my own intelligence, and living a life completely free of manipulation and fear. If you are watching this right now and you are currently shrinking yourself to fit into a life with someone who constantly makes you feel small, confused, or crazy, please hear me. You are not crazy. You are just being lied to. And you have the power to walk out of that kitchen, stop serving the lies, and build a beautiful, quiet life entirely on your own terms. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to reclaim your life from a toxic partner, or if you simply believe that the truth always comes to light, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who might need to hear them the most right now. I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching this video from today? And what time is it where you are? Let me know your thoughts on setting hard boundaries. Until next time, remember to trust your instincts, protect your peace, and never let anyone convince you that you are anything less than formidable. Take care of yourselves. I sit here today in the quiet comfort of my own living room, and I look out the window at the morning light washing over the quiet street below. The silence in this house is completely different from the silence I used to know. For 5 years, I lived inside a silence that felt like a loaded weapon. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a woman constantly walking on eggshells, desperately trying to anticipate the next sudden shift in her husband's mood. It was the breathless, anxious hush of checking bank accounts in the dead of night, wondering where the money was going and wondering why the math never seemed to make sense. That old silence was built entirely on fear and preservation. But the silence I live in now is completely different. It is light, and it is warm, and it is profoundly safe. It is the beautiful, unshakable quiet of a life built entirely on the truth. When I look back at the woman I was during those years, I do not feel anger toward her anymore. I only feel a deep and overwhelming sense of compassion. I know exactly why I stayed as long as I did. I know exactly how the trap was built, because I watched it happen in slow motion. The psychology of manipulation is an incredibly insidious thing. It does not happen overnight. An abuser does not walk through the front door on the first date and announce their intentions to systematically dismantle your self-esteem and drain your financial resources. If they did, we would all walk away immediately. Instead, the manipulation creeps in like a slow, invisible poison. It disguises itself as passion and ambition and a desperate need for your unique support. David used the language of love to construct a prison. He used the very concepts that are supposed to bring two people together and weaponize them to keep me compliant. Words like partnership and loyalty and family were constantly deployed as tools of extraction. Whenever I questioned a strange credit card charge or asked for transparency about our joint assets, he would immediately twist the conversation to put me on the defensive. He would ask me why I did not trust him. He would tell me that a real wife would support her husband's visionary dreams without demanding to see the receipts. He orchestrated a deliberate and sustained campaign to dismantle my perception of reality, feeding me a diet of half-truths and calculated omissions designed to make me question my own basic sanity. This is the most dangerous weapon an emotional abuser possesses. They convince you that your natural intuition is actually a symptom of paranoia. They train you to ignore the alarm bells ringing loudly inside your own head. For years, I allowed David to belittle my career as a payroll manager. He convinced me that my focus on numbers and logistics was boring and small-minded. He needed me to believe that I was unsophisticated, so that I would blindly hand over the control of our marital wealth. He needed me to feel inadequate, so that I would continue working myself to the bone to earn his fleeting approval. Financial abuse rarely exists in a vacuum. It is almost always permanently tethered to emotional and psychological subjugation. An abuser knows that if they can control your access to capital and destroy your confidence in your own intelligence, they can keep you trapped indefinitely. They create an environment where you are entirely dependent on their version of reality. You become so exhausted from the constant cyclical arguments and the desperate attempts to keep the peace that you simply stop asking questions. You surrender your boundaries just to survive the day. But society also plays a massive role in keeping women trapped in these suffocating dynamics. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that marriage is the ultimate measure of a woman's success. We are told that relationships require immense sacrifice and that we must stand by our partners through thick and thin. When things begin to deteriorate, the cultural script tells us to try harder. We are told to go to counseling, to read communication books, to cook better meals, and to shrink our own needs to accommodate the struggles of our spouse. We internalize the belief that a failed marriage is a personal failure. David exploited that societal conditioning with absolute perfection. He knew how deeply I valued my vows. He knew that I viewed the concept of divorce as a tragic defeat. Every time he pushed a boundary or crossed a line, he would instantly pivot to reminding me of the promises we made. He used my own moral compass to navigate his fraud. He relied on my inherent goodness to fund his absolute darkness. He knew I would drain my emergency savings to protect his business, because I believed that is what a devoted partner is supposed to do. He banked on my loyalty to keep his double life completely insulated from consequence. There is a profound and terrifying moment of clarity that occurs when the illusion finally shatters. When my father laid those bank statements and forged property deeds on the mahogany dining table, the entire false narrative I had been living inside collapsed into dust. I saw the calculated cold-blooded theft laid out in raw numbers. I realized in that specific moment that I had not been engaged in a partnership at all. I had been enrolled in a system of absolute servitude. I was a resource to be managed and extracted, not a human being to be loved. Coming to terms with that level of deception requires a massive recalibration of your entire identity. You have to mourn the death of a person who never actually existed. The man I thought I married, the ambitious, charming provider, was nothing but a carefully constructed mask designed to hide a cowardly thief. Grieving a fiction is a very strange and lonely process. You have to untangle the genuine love you gave from the fraudulent affection you received. You have to look at the years you spent building a foundation with someone and accept that they were secretly dismantling it brick by brick behind your back. But within that devastating realization lies the seed of absolute liberation. When you finally see the monster behind the mask, you are no longer bound by their rules. The fear of losing them completely vanishes because you realize there was nothing real to lose in the first place. When I looked at David begging on the floor of my dining room, I did not see a husband in pain. I saw a parasite that had finally been severed from its host. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming wave of relief wash away half a decade of manufactured anxiety. I want to speak directly to anyone listening to this who might be sitting in the dark right now, wondering if they are the crazy one. I want to speak to the woman who is constantly auditing her own behavior, trying to figure out how to be perfectly compliant so her partner will finally treat her with respect. I want to speak to the person who feels a heavy sinking dread in their stomach every time they hear a specific car pull into the driveway. You are not crazy. You are not inadequate. You are not asking for too much when you ask for basic honesty and respect. You are being manipulated by someone who benefits entirely from your confusion. Walking away from a toxic, abusive marriage is not a failure. It is the most courageous and triumphant act of self-respect a person can possibly undertake. It requires you to look at the life you have known, tear it down to the studs, and walk away into the unknown. It requires you to endure the judgment of people who do not understand the reality of your private hell. It requires you to face the terrifying prospect of starting completely over. But I can promise you from the other side of that terror that the unknown is infinitely better than the familiar prison of emotional abuse. Rebuilding your life from the ashes of a fraudulent marriage is a beautiful and empowering process. When you remove a toxic presence from your daily existence, your energy completely returns. The chronic fatigue and the constant ambient stress simply melt away. You begin to rediscover the person you were before you were told you were not enough. You begin to trust your own decisions again. You begin to realize that the skills and the practical intelligence your abuser constantly mocked are the exact tools you need to forge a magnificent, independent life. You must understand that loyalty is a beautiful trait, but it becomes a fatal flaw when it is given to someone who views it as a weakness to be exploited. You cannot love a narcissist into becoming a decent human being. You cannot sacrifice enough of your own happiness to fill the bottomless void inside a person who lacks basic empathy. Their demands will simply grow to match the scale of your surrender. There is a lesson that I had to learn the hardest and most painful way possible, but it is a truth that I now carry with me every single day. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire to keep a liar warm. Your worth is not defined by how much abuse you can endure in the name of love. Your capacity for suffering is not a measure of your devotion. True love does not require you to abandon your own reality. It does not ask you to finance deceit. It does not make you feel small so that someone else can feel tall. If you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your reality is constantly denied and your boundaries are treated as an inconvenience, you have the absolute right to pack your bags, gather your evidence, and walk out the door. You do not need their permission to leave. You do not need them to validate your reasons. You simply need to choose yourself. The moment you decide that your peace of mind is more important than their manufactured drama, the invisible chains holding you in place will shatter. I survived the darkest, most humiliating betrayal I could have ever imagined, and I did not just survive it. I used the exact analytical skills my husband despised to completely dismantle his fraudulent life and protect my own future. I reclaimed my finances. I reclaimed my career. I reclaimed my home. And most importantly, I reclaimed my own mind. The peace I feel sitting in this quiet, sunlit room is worth every single tear I shed during the escape. You hold the exact same power inside yourself. The intuition you have been trained to ignore is still there waiting for you to listen. The strength you think you have lost has simply been buried under years of calculated exhaustion. Once you make the decision to step into the light and demand the truth, you will be absolutely amazed by how quickly your strength returns. You will build a new life that is so vibrant and so secure that the memory of the person who tried to destroy you will simply fade into irrelevance. If you have ever had to unmask a liar or set a hard boundary with someone you once loved, I want to hear your story. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Take care of yourselves. You deserve it.